It was a sunny Saturday morning in the Johnson household. The birds were chirping outside, and the sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Mr. Johnson was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, while his son, Tim, sat across from him, eating cereal. "Good morning, Tim," Mr. Johnson said with a smile. "Good morning, Dad," Tim replied, looking up from his bowl. "What are we going to do today?" "Well," Mr. Johnson began, setting down his coffee mug, "I thought we could spend some time together. Maybe we could work on that birdhouse we started last weekend." Tim's eyes lit up. "Yes, I've been waiting to finish it. Can we paint it too?" "Of course we can. I bought some paint yesterday. We have red, blue, and yellow. Which color would you like to use?" Tim thought for a moment, then said, "I think we should paint it blue. That way, it will look like the sky." Mr. Johnson nodded. "Blue it is. But first, we need to finish our breakfast. Then we can head outside and start working." As they finished their breakfast, they chatted about the week. Tim told his father about his school projects and the new things he had learned in science class. Mr. Johnson listened carefully, asking questions and encouraging Tim to share more. After breakfast, they headed to the garage, where the half-finished birdhouse sat on a workbench. Tim picked up a hammer while Mr. Johnson grabbed some nails. "Okay, Tim," Mr. Johnson said. "Remember to be careful when using the hammer. Hold the nail steady, and tap it lightly at first." Tim nodded, concentrating on his task. He placed the nail on the edge of the birdhouse and gently tapped it with a hammer. It took a few tries, but eventually, he got the hang of it. "Great job, Tim," Mr. Johnson praised. "You're becoming quite the carpenter." Tim beamed with pride. "Thanks, Dad. It's fun building things with you." They spent the next hour working together, finishing the birdhouse and adding a coat of blue paint. By the time they were done, their hands were covered in paint, and they were both laughing. "This was a great morning, Dad," Tim said as they cleaned up their tools. "I agree," Mr. Johnson replied. "I love spending time with you. It's important to me that we do things together." Tim smiled. "Me too, Dad." The next day, Tim and his father were sitting in the living room, watching a movie. Halfway through, Mr. Johnson paused the movie and turned to his son. "Tim," he began, "I've been thinking. You're growing up, and it's time for you to take on a little more responsibility around the house." Tim looked curious. "What do you mean, Dad?" "Well," Mr. Johnson said, "I think you're ready to have a few chores of your own. It's a way to help out the family and learn how to take care of things." Tim nodded slowly. "What kind of chores?" Mr. Johnson smiled. "I was thinking you could start by taking care of the trash and keeping your room tidy. Maybe later, we can add a few more things, like helping with the dishes or feeding the dog." Tim thought for a moment. "I can do that. I want to help." "I'm glad to hear that," Mr. Johnson said. "It's important to be responsible and take care of our home. Plus, it's a good way to learn important life skills." Tim nodded, feeling proud that his father trusted him with more responsibilities. "I'll start today," he said. "That's the spirit," Mr. Johnson replied, ruffling Tim's hair. "I'll help you get started, and soon, you'll be able to do it all on your own." They spent the rest of the afternoon organizing Tim's room and taking out the trash. Mr. Johnson showed Tim how to properly separate recyclables and how to make his bed neatly. "Taking care of our things shows that we respect what we have," Mr. Johnson explained as they worked. Tim listened carefully, wanting to do a good job. By the time they were done, his room was clean, and the trash had been taken out. "Thanks for helping me, Dad," Tim said as they finished. "You're welcome, Tim," Mr. Johnson replied. "I'm proud of you for taking on these new responsibilities. It shows that you're growing up." Tim smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "I'm glad I can help." The following weekend, Mr. Johnson and Tim decided to go for a walk in the park. It was a beautiful day, and they wanted to enjoy the fresh air and sunshine. As they walked, they talked about everything and anything. They discussed school, friends, and what they wanted to do during the upcoming summer vacation. "Dad," Tim said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, Tim," You can ask me anything, Mr. Johnson replied. Tim hesitated for a moment, then asked, Do you think I'm old enough to ride my bike to school by myself? Mr. Johnson thought for a moment. Well, Tim, I think you're getting close to being old enough. But riding to school on your own is a big responsibility. There are a few things we need to make sure of first. Like what? Tim asked, curious. First, you need to know the rules of the road and be comfortable riding in traffic, Mr. Johnson explained. We also need to make sure you can handle your bike safely and follow all the safety rules, like wearing your helmet. Tim nodded. I always wear my helmet, and I know the rules. I've been practicing. That's great, Mr. Johnson said. But it's also important that you know how to handle any situation that might come up, like if you have a flat tire or if you need help. Tim looked determined. I can learn, Dad. I really want to try. Mr. Johnson smiled. I know you do, Tim. How about this? We can start by riding together to school a few times. If you show me that you're ready, we can talk about you riding on your own. Tim grinned. Deal. They continued their walk, enjoying the sights and sounds of the park. Mr. Johnson pointed out different types of trees and birds, teaching Tim about nature as they strolled. Thanks for always teaching me things, Dad, Tim said as they neared the end of their walk. I enjoy it, Tim, Mr. Johnson replied. It's important to me that you learn and grow. I want you to be prepared for anything that comes your way. Tim felt a deep sense of gratitude for his father. I'm lucky to have you as my dad. And I'm lucky to have you as my son, Mr. Johnson replied, putting his arm around Tim's shoulders as they walked home. A few weeks later, Tim came home from school looking upset. Mr. Johnson noticed right away and asked, What's wrong, Tim? Tim sighed and said, I had a bad day at school. I didn't do well on my math test, and I'm worried I'm not good at math. Mr. Johnson sat down next to Tim. I'm sorry to hear that, Tim. But remember, everyone has bad days. It's important not to give up. Let's take a look at the test together, and maybe we can figure out what went wrong. Tim nodded, feeling a little better. He handed the test to his father, who looked it over carefully. Okay, I see where you made some mistakes, Mr. Johnson said. But the good news is that these are things we can work on. How about we spend some time this evening going over your math problems? Tim agreed, and they spent the next hour working through the test. Mr. Johnson patiently explained each problem, helping Tim understand where he had gone wrong. By the end of their study session, Tim felt more confident. Thanks for helping me, Dad. I think I understand it now. You're welcome, Tim, Mr. Johnson replied. The important thing is that you keep trying and don't get discouraged. Everyone struggles sometimes, but with practice, you'll get better.
Tim nodded, feeling determined to improve. I'm going to keep practicing until I get it right. That's the spirit, Mr. Johnson said with a smile. And remember, I'm always here to help you, no matter what. Tim felt a deep sense of appreciation for his father's support. I'm lucky to have you, Dad. And I'm lucky to have you, Tim, Mr. Johnson replied, giving his son a hug. As the school year progressed, Tim continued to work hard and improve in all areas of his life. He took on more responsibilities at home, became more confident in his abilities, and grew closer to his father. One evening, as they were sitting together after dinner, Tim turned to his father and said, Dad, I've been thinking. I've learned a lot from you this year. Not just about school or chores, but about life. Mr. Johnson smiled. I'm glad to hear that, Tim. It means a lot to me that you feel that way. Tim nodded. I've realized how important it is to have a family that supports you. You've always been there for me, and I want to be there for you too. Mr. Johnson felt a surge of pride. That's a wonderful thing to say, Tim. Family is the most important thing in the world. We take care of each other, support each other, and love each other. Tim smiled. I'm going to keep working hard and doing my best because I want to make you proud. You already do, Tim, Mr. Johnson replied. I'm proud of the person you're becoming. You're kind, responsible, and always willing to learn. Those are qualities that will take you far in life. Tim felt a warm sense of fulfillment. Thanks, Dad. I'm going to keep growing and learning, just like you taught me. Mr. Johnson nodded. And I'll be here to support you every step of the way. As they sat together, enjoying the quiet evening, Tim felt a deep sense of contentment. He knew that no matter what challenges life brought, he could always count on his father's love and support. And that made all the difference in the world.